Black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm blacker than black, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm blacker than black, and I'm black, y'all. I'm blickety black, blacker than black, black, I'm blacker than black, yo, because I'm black and I'm back. Yo, I'm black and I'm black, y'all, and I'm blacker than black, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm blacker than black, and I'm black, y'all.
The victims of the Democratic playing card deck. This group makes up the core of the voting element as far as the Democratic Party goes, and thus helps the most to promote the leftist cause. These are the people who think they've been wrong or disadvantaged, or have been told that they've been wronged or disadvantaged. They're also being told that the opposing parties, Republicans and conservatives, are out to wrong them and disadvantage them even further. These are the things commonly referred to as playing the race/age/gender/class card. This is used very often by liberals, so get ready to hear a lot of it. It works, it is effective, and this second group of people, the victims, falls for it very easily. As a result, they become slaves of the liberal mindset. Look no further than how the Democrats try to scare African Americans into believing that Republicans are holding them down, how the Democrats try to scare middle-class Americans into thinking Republicans are hurting the middle class, and how the Democrats try to scare women into thinking Republicans are against their rights. Democrats also frequently try to scare senior citizens into thinking Republicans want to destroy Social Security. Look at the key words mentioned in these accusations: against, holding down, hurting, destroying. In essence, it is fear-mongering targeted at certain groups of people in society, and it works. These Democrats and leftists attempt to spin the issues into backing up this fear-mongering, and people listen to it. And as a result, this entire second group is formed the victims of the Democratic playing card deck. These people often do not know much about the issues, especially as far as fact and reality goes. What they do think they know, however, is that Republicans and conservatives are completely against them and trying to hold them down, or their issue, in general. They believe the way they do because of the total spin and fear-mongering they hear from Democratic and liberal leaders. They then go out and vote for these said Democrats, and become strong leftists, mostly out of fear and loathing of the other side values instilled into them. Furthermore, they become very likely to start calling conservatives bigots and racists, because of the lies that the liberal left has drilled into their heads.
Civil rights and monumental lies. 742. Shares. Facebook, Twitter, subscribe. Note: the Radiance Foundation does not advocate for any particular political candidate. We simply advocate for the truth. A lot has changed since the party of Lincoln took on the inhumanity of racism and passed landmark legislation to restore what the institution of slavery tried to destroy. Despite the rhetoric from many liberals' mouths that nothing has changed since the second civil rights era, we had a president of mixed racial lineage in the White House. I'm as black as Obama, and our country has come a long way. From slavery to the presidency, many barriers have been overcome since President Abraham Lincoln issued that monumental declaration, the Emancipation Proclamation, and changed the course of history. The Radiance Foundation calls out the Democrat Party's blatant dishonesty about America's civil rights struggle. The Democrat Party, the party of slavery, separate but equal Jim Crow laws, lynchings, KKK, poll taxes, literacy tests, and now the party of unlimited abortion and infanticide, doesn't seem to like its role in that history. Anytime you hear so-called progressive politicians talking about civil rights, they act as if the Democrat Party led the fight for African Americans, women, and other minorities in this country. It was the Republican Party that introduced and passed all Reconstruction Amendments, 13th through the 15th, and introduced nearly every African American civil rights bill from the end of the Civil War through the mid-20th century. The civil rights bills of the 50s and 60s were mere copies of bills defeated by Democrats nearly 100 years prior, and the GOP still voted in overwhelmingly larger margins than Dems in the 20th century's civil rights legislation. Yet the DNC gets away with launching historical drivel like votingrightsmatter.org. An advertising effort launched to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Ironically, it was Democrats who voted unanimously against the 15th Amendment, S.J. Res. 8, which guaranteed the right to vote, for men, at least, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Voting rights do matter. Civil rights do matter. But without life, without truth, nothing else matters. It's one thing to have a two-party system where there are deep ideological chasms between both sides. It's quite another to have one party falsely, and absurdly, claiming the mantle of the other. There's no mention, throughout the Voting Rights Matter site, that Lincoln was a Republican, or that Republicans abolished slavery, or that Republicans were the ones to protect blacks' civil rights and oversee the Reconstruction of the South, although ending, tragically, in Republican President Hayes and the Democrat Party's deal to withdraw all federal troops from the South, or that Republicans were the ones who overwhelmingly passed the 19th Amendment. Yes. House Republicans voted as a large majority to ensure women's right to vote, 91% GOP versus only 60% Democrats. It was Republicans, thanks to the 14th Amendment, who made people of my complexion, American. Not a single Democrat in the House or the Senate voted for it. These are all inconvenient truths for the Democrat political machine whose media and university academic allies help them reshape the Democrat Party's past. Sadly, today's GOP leadership lacks the spine of those who were once called radical Republicans, who courageously fought to change the political landscape because they believed that we're all created equal. From 2005 to 2011, Democrats.org, the official site of the Democrat Party, had the audacity to claim, "We've worked to pass every one of our nation's civil rights laws. On every civil rights issue, Democrats have led the fight." The Radiance Foundation has created a civil rights timeline fact sheet that exposes how absurdly false this is. The quote needs to be filed under the lie of the century. It was Democrats who passed Black Code and Jim Crow laws further dehumanizing recently emancipated slaves. The Civil Rights Act of 1871, known as the Ku Klux Klan Act, was passed by the GOP and unanimously voted against by Democrats. This act sought to end the terrorist violence and murder by the KKK of black and white Republicans. Nothing says voter suppression like a cross burning in your yard or a lynching. But the Democrat Party, desperate to rewrite its DNA of racial division and oppression, has created a scapegoat for its own failures: the Republicans. Even anti-lynching legislation, such as Republican Leonidas Dyer's 1918 bill, couldn't get Democrat support. In 1922, the Republican-controlled House passed the anti-lynching bill only for the legislation to die in the Senate because Democrats wouldn't allow a vote. Lack of political fortitude allowed the bill to languish for years, with Congress failing to pass such vital legislation to protect American citizens from such heinous scare tactics. This is history. And it profoundly affects the present, especially when most Americans have no idea which political ideology is truly liberating. The often Democrat-heralded Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed by more Republicans than Democrats. The landmark bill passed out of the House by only 60% of Dems yet 80% of Republicans. In the Senate, the margin was 70% of Dems and 79% of the GOP. The final bill's passage was made possible by a smaller margin of Democrats, again, with 60% of Dems and a much larger 77% of Republicans. It's been over 50 years since the landmark passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was a long time coming. Justice, sometimes, takes a while. But this monumental piece of civil rights legislation tore down some of the last strangleholds of eugenics-based social policies like poll taxes and literacy tests. Jim Crow was righteously trampled as the nation marched toward equality. The ACLU, NAACP, and scores of liberal groups fan the flames of fear, acting as if this is the 1960s, and Democrats, wait, did I say that? Republicans are trying to suppress the black vote. As always, these progressives are like the boy who cried wolf, they're just louder and their cry is racism. Sadly, it renders the word meaningless when it's used at every turn. Poll taxes and literacy tests, an extension of eugenics-based social policies, were deeply racist. Those were real acts of voter suppression. Literacy tests were crazy. No, really, they were insane. Take a look at Louisiana's literacy test from the 1963 to 1964. It was a series of 30 questions that the voter had to answer in 10 minutes with 0 mistakes. Good luck with that. These despicable practices disenfranchised many blacks in the South. The VRA crushed those practices and gave teeth to the law by allowing the federal government to prosecute those who tried to violate the civil rights legislation. The vote tallies for the Voting Rights Act of 1965 don't mesh, however, with mainstream media's liberal narrative. You won't ever see or hear these numbers from today's so-called journalists. It takes citizen journalists to actually educate the public. In the VRA, 94% of Senate Republicans voted for it, only 69% of Senate Democrats did. Whereas 6% of the GOP voted against the VRA, a whopping 24% of Democrats did. The faux cries of voter suppression and PR efforts like votingrightsmatter.org are just scare tactics painting the GOP as the party that wants to take away our precious right to vote. Though most liberals won't make the common sense connection, abortion is the ultimate form of voter suppression. Imagine the political power of the black community that hasn't been robbed of over 16 million voters, violently eliminated before birth. But race politics are never about common sense, they're about dollars and cents. There's huge political machinery on both sides of the aisle, and truth is rarely the end goal. Deep pockets are. Sadly, the GOP establishment runs away and hides when the Democrat Party makes its historically challenged accusations, instead of standing proud of its historical accomplishments. I wish today's GOPs had the soul and the spine of the radicals of the party of Lincoln. Not one mainstream media outlet takes the DNC's historical trip of fantasy to task. They parrot it instead. Not one major news network, except Fox News, has challenged their blatantly false civil rights talking points. No political party is our salvation. It's up to us. We can choose to seek and know the truth, or continue to be manipulated by those with a perpetual agenda to be re-elected and in control. We can choose to be the victims that liberals so desperately need, or the victors who reject today's self-proclaimed civil rights movement. We need to know the difference regardless of race or ethnicity between being empowered and being fooled by those in power. Show some love and support our factivism. Make a tax-deductible donation today. This piece has been adapted from Crystal Wright's new book, Con Job: How Democrats Gave Us Crime, Sanctuary Cities, Abortion Profiteering, and Racial Division. It's well known how in 1965 Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Assistant Secretary of Labor to Democrat President Johnson, warned that the black family was on the verge of a complete breakdown because of growing illegitimacy rates. In 1963 the out-of-wedlock birth rate for whites was 3%, and for blacks it was 23.6%. Moynihan was part of a generation of Democrats who cared about lifting blacks up into the ranks of equal opportunity with whites, back in the days before the Democrat Party became completely morally corrupt. In his 1965, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, Moynihan observed that because more blacks were being born into unmarried homes, more blacks were becoming dependent on welfare to survive. Then, as now, blacks represented only a small percentage of the U.S. population but a disproportionate percentage of people relying on public assistance. At the center of this tangle of pathology, as Moynihan called it, was the weakness of the family structure among blacks. Once or twice removed, it will be found to be the principal source of most of the aberrant, inadequate, or antisocial behavior that did not establish, but now serves to perpetuate the cycle of poverty and deprivation. The majority of black babies are being born to single mothers, a prescription for a life of poverty and crime. Ever since, the problem has only gotten worse. The majority of black babies are being born to single mothers, a prescription for a life of poverty and crime. And despite the warnings that have sounded off loudly for over half a century, Democrats have done nothing to stop blacks, their most steadfast constituents, from having babies they can't take care of. This problem has perpetuated itself for generations, producing generational poverty among blacks. If black lives truly matter, as Democrats shout at the top of their lungs, why don't they promulgate policies that encourage blacks to get married before they have kids? Blacks voting overwhelmingly for Democrats over the past half-century is the quintessential definition of political suicide. But what's bad for blacks translates into a high rate of return on investment for Democrats. Marketing the "no baby daddy" syndrome to blacks has translated into votes, lots of votes, approaching 100% from blacks over the past half-century. And the black family has been dismembered in the process, like the fetuses Planned Parenthood chops up to sell for profit. Democrats don't quit while they're ahead. No, the Donkey Party doubles down on evil. In his 1992 acceptance speech for the Democrat presidential nomination, Bill Clinton declared, "Governments don't raise children, parents do. And you should." Clinton meant to say, if you're white, I expect you to raise your kids, because Democrats have made it their priority for society to normalize the idea that the federal government should be responsible for parenting blacks and their children. Neither Clinton nor any Democrat president since Johnson has done anything effective to ask black Americans as a race to take responsibility for raising our kids. No greater or more glaring example of liberals profiting politically off of black people's misery can be seen than the Democrats' refusal to address the illegitimate birth rate spiraling out of control among blacks. More black babies are born out of wedlock today, 72%, than into married homes. That's dramatically worse than when Moynihan initially raised the issue, when it was 23%, thanks to 50 years of encouragement by the Democrat Party. In other words, in America today, it is rare for black babies to be born to married parents. Black fathers are simply not part of the black family equation. Think about that. Black fathers are simply not part of the black family equation. Think about that. A few years ago, my mother tutored a 4-year-old black girl in pre-K at a Richmond, Virginia public school. It was part of an after-school program organized by her church's outreach ministry. One afternoon in February, my mother was explaining to the little girl the meaning of Valentine's Days. Helping the child make a card for her mother, my mother told her that she was going to give Valentine's Day cards to special people like her husband and her children. The little girl looked up at my mother in disbelief, asking, "You can have a husband?" Slightly shocked and a little taken aback, my mother simply responded, "Yes." It's a sad state of affairs when the word husband is a foreign word to a little black girl. A few weeks later, around Easter, the little girl asked my mother again, "Mrs. Wright, you have a husband?" "Yes," my mother responded. "Husbands, friends, they're all the same," replied the little girl. No, they certainly are not all the same. But the little girl probably had gone home and asked her single mother what a husband was, and her mother had told her that. It's difficult to have a conversation with a 4-year-old about the importance of marriage. But the problem is that this little girl will grow up with her mother's message that husbands are just the same as boyfriends. Based on the statistics, she will likely follow her mother's bad example and have a baby out of wedlock. Women having babies without fathers isn't just a sign of the moral collapse of our culture, it's hazardous to the child. When a child is born into a single-parent home, the chances of that child's growing up in poverty are much greater. According to a Brookings Institution study published in 2009, if a person graduates from high school, works a full-time job, and waits until 21 to get married and have children, his or her chance of succeeding in life and becoming a member of the middle class rises to 76%. If a person doesn't finish high school, doesn't marry, and has a baby before the age of 21, his or her chance of becoming poor soars to 74%. One of the anti-poverty solutions the Brookings study recommended was for the federal government to advocate policies that strengthen families, such as programs to reduce unplanned pregnancies for teens and 20-somethings. The Brookings researchers seem to have understood that the breakdown of the black family has been the main driver of the chronic wealth gap between whites and blacks over the past 5 decades. The lack of intact families among blacks leads to a lack of education and jobs, which translates into higher rates of crime and government dependency among blacks. Eureka! You don't have to be a neurosurgeon to see that a child born to an unmarried teenage mother isn't going to have a rosy future in life. The conclusions of the Brookings research are obvious, but Democrats continue to ignore the plain truth. Back in 1965, Moynihan was pelted with virulent criticism for telling the truth about Black America. Things have only gotten worse since then.
It's time for a reality check. 990 people were shot by cops in 2016. 748 of those were while an attack was in progress. 216 were other factors. 44 were undetermined. Of the 990, 948 were male. 42 were female. 494 were white. 258 were black. 172 were Hispanic. 66 were other races. 782 of the 990 had a deadly weapon on them. 54 used a vehicle as a weapon. 34 had a toy weapon. The only disparity out there is, whites are killed more often and have more run-ins with cops than black people do. On average, 4,472 black men were killed by other black men annually between January 1, 2009, and December 31, 2012, according to the FBI's supplementary homicide reports. Using FBI and CDC statistics, University of Toledo criminologist Dr. Richard R. Johnson calculates that 112 black men, on average, suffered both justified and unjustified police-involved deaths annually during this period. This equals 2.5% of these 4,472 yearly deaths. For every black man, criminal or innocent, killed by a cop, 40 black men were murdered by other black men. At most, 2.5% of the problem generates relentless rage. And, yet, it is rude to racists to mention 97.5% of the problem. Fact 1. Over 1,400 more black Americans murdered other blacks in 2 years than were lynched from 1882 to 1968. According to FBI data, 4,906 black people murdered other blacks in 2010 and 2011. That is 1,460 more black Americans killed by other blacks in 2 years than were lynched from 1882 to 1968, according to the Tuskegee Institute. Fact 2. Black people, mostly men, commit a grossly disproportionate amount of crime. In 2012, white males were 38% of the population and committed 4,582 murders. That same year, black males were just 6.6% of the population, but committed a staggering 5,531 murders. In other words, black people, at just a fifth of the size, committed almost 1,000 more murders than their white counterparts. The figures above highlight a horrific truth that black racialists and white liberals routinely ignore. Law-breaking black Americans, young black males particularly, put themselves in close proximity to mostly white male police officers at rates sometimes 5 to 10 times higher than whites. This is a recipe for disaster. Fact 3. Despite making up just 13% of the population, blacks committed half of homicides in the United States for nearly 30 years. DOJ statistics show that between 1980 and 2008, black people committed 52% of homicides. In 2013, black criminals committed 38% of the murders. Whites accounted for just 31%. There are 5 times fewer black people than white people in America, and yet, they consistently carry out a larger share of the crimes. Given this rate, it's no wonder that there isn't more incidents where cops kill black criminals. Fact 4. Chicago's death toll is almost equal to that of both wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, combined. There have been almost as many deaths in one American city as there have been in the two major wars carried out by the U.S. military this century. Chicago's death toll from 2001 November 26, 2015 stands at 7,401. The combined total deaths during Operation Iraqi Freedom 2003 to 2015, 4,815, and Operation Enduring Freedom, Afghanistan, 2001 to 2015, 3,506, total 8,321. Fact 5. It would take cops 40 years to kill as many black men as have died at the hands of others black men in 2012 alone. University of Toledo criminologist Dr. Richard R. Johnson examined the latest crime data from the FBI's Supplementary Homicide Reports and Centers for Disease Control and found that an average of 4,472 black men were killed by other black men annually between January 1, 2009 and December 31, 2012. Professor Johnson's research further concluded that 112 black men died from both justified and unjustified police-involved killings annually during this same period.
Shocked by Segregation. By Kevin D. Williamson. August 24, 2016, 8 a.m., but it is not in the South. The headline was familiar and predictable. U.S.'s most economically segregated schools aren't where you might expect. Maybe not where you expect if you're a Cambridge-dwelling headline writer for the Christian Science Monitor, but more or less exactly where you'd expect if you spent much time in the actual United States of America. Underline, only one southern state made the top 10 list, gasp and exclamation point implicit. Economic segregation, like racial segregation, is a condition that certainly exists in the South, but that is much more pronounced in our large, Democrat-dominated northeastern metros, and in West Coast cities such as San Francisco, where the spotlessly progressive municipal authorities have for a generation used restrictive zoning laws to drive out the sort of people who aren't on a first-name basis with any venture capitalists. From the pitiless Romans we received the term to decimate, meaning to eliminate every 10th man in a military unit, usually as a punishment for mutiny or desertion. Since 1990, San Francisco has outdone Crassus and eliminated every third African American resident, though to be fair, San Francisco's policies are not intentionally designed to drive out black people, but to drive out poor people. Black billionaires are welcome in San Francisco, as they are in most places. Racial segregation and economic segregation are different phenomena, but they are related, which probably is inevitable given the very different economic situations of different American demographic groups. Indian Americans have household incomes on average in excess of $100,000 a year, whereas African Americans have a median household income of around $35,000 a year. African American was never a particularly useful term. Africa is a big, diverse place, and it is becoming less useful by the year, inasmuch as some African American subgroups, notably Americans of Nigerian background, have incomes that exceed the national average by a large margin, a fact that is no doubt related to the fact that Nigerian Americans pursue advanced degrees at 4 to 6 times the average U.S. rate. Jay Nordlinger relates a story about a high-achieving Lumbee Indian whose pursuit of academic and professional advancement had his sister accusing him of acting white, to which he replied that acting white wasn't enough, that he intended to act Jewish or Chinese. He could have added act Nigerian. Cities such as San Francisco are in part victims of their own success. A great many people want to live there, so there's a great deal of demand for real estate. That's one side of the equation. Policy comes in on the supply side, with political barriers to building keeping the stock of housing artificially limited, which is great for homeowners, who have lots of political clout, but stinks for younger, lower-income people looking to buy or rent, who don't have very much political clout. Part of that is a general American phenomenon. We simply will not endure ordinary urban population density, never mind comparing it with Lagos or Taipei. New York City's density is well under half that of such ordinary cities as Barcelona, Buenos Aires, or Warsaw. New York is remarkable among U.S. cities for its tall buildings, and remarkable among world cities for its lack of them. Only a tiny number of New York City residences, less than 2%, are located in tall buildings, meaning those 20 stories or taller, far less than in comparable cities around the world. The number is even lower for cities such as Los Angeles, which actually has a higher population density than New York, and San Francisco. Building taller buildings makes urban residential real estate less expensive per square foot. You can have higher buildings or higher prices. New York, where the nice progressives want to put caps on tall buildings, has chosen higher prices and, therefore, economic segregation, pushing the poor farther into the Bronx or New Jersey. One Manhattan doorman of my acquaintance commuted from Pennsylvania. And in terms of building restrictions, New York is the Wild West compared with San Francisco. Local reform is needed in places such as New York and San Francisco, but we can be reasonably confident that Wall Street and Silicon Valley will, in the end, take care of themselves. We have examples to guide us. In Harris County, the greater Houston area, the median monthly household income is 3 times the median monthly homeownership cost for a family with a mortgage. In San Francisco County, where incomes are higher, but housing prices are also much higher, the median monthly income is only twice the median monthly cost of housing. That's before taxes. For the median income family in San Francisco County, earning just shy of $80,000 a year, that $3,200 a month in housing expenses does not leave a lot of wiggle room in the rest of the household budget, especially considering the higher taxes and other expenses they'll pay. The median Houston family earns only 70% of its San Francisco counterpart, but its housing expenses are less than half as much. The math here is pretty ugly, using the old 5 times your income guideline. The median San Francisco family cannot begin to afford the median home there, which costs more than $765,000, or 9 times the median family income. That's the median family. How much less room for error do the families in the below the median half enjoy? Mr. and Mrs. Average have a pretty tough time, but things are a lot worse for Mr. and Mrs. Below Average. The racial aspect is easier to track, thanks to the census. In 1970, there were nearly 100,000 African Americans in San Francisco. In 1990, there were about 78,000 black residents. Today, there are about 51,000 black residents. African Americans once were the majority population in San Francisco's Bayview. Today, at less than 6% of San Francisco's population, they make up a majority of the population only in its jails. In 1970, there were nearly 100,000 African Americans in San Francisco. Today, there are about 51,000. There is a great deal more to what ails the poor and long-suffering African American communities than housing policy. And most of those economically segregated and shockingly non-Southern cities that worry the gentle people at the Christian Science Monitor are not victims of their own success. They are Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland, etc., which also are among our most racially segregated cities, those being New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. Housing is pretty cheap there. The problem is in the demand side of the market. Nobody wants to move to Detroit, and few people are leaving Texas or California for a great new job in Cleveland. We know how to fix bad housing policy. In truth, we know how to fix a great many bad policies, education, public safety, afflicting Detroit and Cleveland too. But the problems in those cities are not entirely unlike the housing problems that beset San Francisco and New York. The bad public policies that keep those cities down benefit somebody. Somebody keeps those cities' failed institutions in place, somebody resists reform, somebody evades accountability, and helps others do the same. Who? Would it be too much to suggest we take a real hard look at who's running those cities? I just heard the best description of the modern plantation from Dinesh D'Souza. I couldn't have laid it out any better. As you're listening to this, remember when AOC didn't want Amazon to come to New York City? Something that Charles Barkley, the basketball player, commented on, and he's talking about the present, not about the past. A very interesting parable. Barkley goes, I've been noticing that poor people have been voting for the Democratic Party for 50 years, and they're still poor. Now what's he getting at? I think what he's saying is that what we have seen in Detroit, St. Louis, and in Baltimore, in the inner cities of this country. A kind of revival of the old. Well, it's a new form of the old plantation, and what I mean by that is if you think of the plantation as people living in complete dependency. They can't get off the plantation. Now they get their basic provisions on the plantation, but it's very meager, but nevertheless it's enough to sustain you, and you're there and you're stuck. Now, I'm not saying that the inner city is the same, obviously it's not the same, people aren't being forced to work against their will. In fact, a lot of them aren't working, but there is a certain kind of frozenness to the plantation, and what I notice is very bizarre and very telling is that when there are efforts to change the plantation they are vigorously fought by progressives and progressive Democrats. So for example, in a lot of inner cities now, there are these gentrification movements in which yuppies come in with technology companies and they say, all right, you know what we're going to do, we're going to put in all these new buildings, we're going to create all these new jobs, we're going to open Starbucks, we're going to create all this enterprise, and we're going to make this into a kind of enterprise zone of productivity and prosperity, and we're also going to pay money to the people who are in there now. So they can move elsewhere or stay here, and if they stay here there will be more jobs and better food, and we're going to clean up the place, and crime rates will go down. Progressive Democrats will inevitably mobilize and fight desperately to block these gentrification schemes. More jobs, more prosperity, less crime, safer neighborhoods. What's not to like? And if you have to move, your property values have gone up already enormously, so you can sell and cash out and move where you want. But no, you have to fight these progressive Democrats. Why? Because you can't disrupt the plantation. The plantation has its uses. There are different forms of exploitation. If you have figured out a way to create a political class that you depend on politically, that's delivering 90% of its votes to you, and if any of those guys got jobs and moved out they would no longer be beholden to you. That's not a very good situation, and it bears an uncanny resemblance to the policies of the past. The name of that political class? The victims of the Democratic playing card deck. This group makes up the core of the voting element as far as the Democratic Party goes, and thus helps the most to promote the leftist cause. These are the people who think they've been wrong or disadvantaged, or have been told that they've been wronged or disadvantaged, by politicians or by academia, the intellectual left. They're also being told that the opposing party are out to wrong them and disadvantage them even further. These are the things commonly referred to as playing the race, age, gender, or class card. This is used the most by liberals, so get ready to hear a lot of it. It works, it is effective, and this second group of people, the victims, fall for it very easily. As a result, they become slaves of the liberal mindset. Pun intended. Look no further than how the progressive Democrats try to scare African Americans into believing that conservatives are holding them down, how the progressive Democrats try to scare middle-class Americans into thinking conservatives are hurting the middle class, and how the progressive Democrats try to scare women into thinking conservatives are against their rights. Progressive Democrats also frequently try to scare senior citizens into thinking conservatives want to destroy Social Security. Look at the key words mentioned in these accusations: against, holding down, hurting, destroying. In essence, it is fear-mongering targeted at certain groups of people in society, and it works. These progressive Democrats and leftists attempt to spin the issues into backing up this fear-mongering, and people listen to it. And as a result, this entire second group is formed, the victims of the Democratic playing card deck. These people often do not know much about the issues, especially as far as fact and reality goes. What they do think they know, however, is that conservatives are completely against them and trying to hold them down, or their issue in general. They believe the way they do because of the total spin and fear-mongering they hear from progressive Democrat leaders. They then go out and vote for these said progressive Democrats, and become strong leftists, mostly out of fear and loathing of the other side, values instilled into them. Furthermore, they become very likely to start calling conservatives bigots and racists, because of the lies that the liberal left has drilled into their heads. And yet, they'll remain just as poor, nothing will change, and they'll probably die on the progressive Democrat plantation.
Once upon a time, every student of history, and that meant pretty much everyone with a high school education, knew this. The Democratic Party was the party of slavery and Jim Crow, and the Republican Party was the party of emancipation and racial integration. Democrats were the Confederacy, and Republicans were the Union. Jim Crow Democrats were dominant in the South, and socially tolerant Republicans were dominant in the North. But then, in the 1960s and 70s, everything supposedly flipped. Suddenly, the Republicans became the racists, and the Democrats became the champions of civil rights. Fabricated by left-leaning academic elites and journalists, the story went like this. Republicans couldn't win a national election by appealing to the better nature of the country. They could only win by appealing to the worst. Attributed to Richard Nixon, the media's all-purpose bad guy, this came to be known as the Southern Strategy. It was very simple. Win elections by winning the South. And to win the South, appeal to racists. So the Republicans, the party of Lincoln, were to now be labeled the party of rednecks. But this story of the two parties switching identities is a myth. In fact, it's three myths wrapped into one false narrative. Let's take a brief look at each myth in turn. Myth number one. In order to be competitive in the South, Republicans started to pander to white racists in the 1960s. Fact, Republicans actually became competitive in the South as early as 1928 when Republican Herbert Hoover won over 47% of the South's popular vote against Democrat Al Smith. In 1952, Republican President Dwight Eisenhower won the southern states of Tennessee, Florida, and Virginia. And in 1956, he picked up Louisiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia too. And that was after he supported the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education that desegregated public schools, and after he sent the 101st Airborne to Little Rock Central High School to enforce integration. Myth number two, Southern Democrats, angry with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, switched parties. Fact, of the 21 Democratic senators who opposed the Civil Rights Act, just one became a Republican. The other 20 continued to be elected as Democrats or were replaced by other Democrats. On average, those 20 seats didn't go Republican for another 2.5 decades. Myth number three. Since the implementation of the Southern Strategy, the Republicans have dominated the South. Fact, Richard Nixon, the man who is often credited with creating the Southern Strategy, lost the Deep South in 1968. In contrast, Democrat Jimmy Carter nearly swept the region in 1976, 12 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in 1992, over 28 years later, Democrat Bill Clinton won Georgia, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. The truth is, Republicans didn't hold a majority of Southern congressional seats until 1994, 30 years after the Civil Rights Act. As Kevin Williamson of National Review writes, if Southern rednecks ditched the Democrats because of a civil rights law passed in 1964, it is strange that they waited until the late 1980s and early 1990s to do so. They say things move slower in the South, but not that slow. So what really happened? Why does the South now vote overwhelmingly Republican? Because the South itself has changed. Its values have changed. The racism that once defined it doesn't anymore. Its values today are conservative ones, pro-life, pro-gun, and pro-small government. And here's the proof. Southern whites are far more likely to vote for a black conservative like Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina than a white liberal. In short, history has moved on. Like other regions of the country, the South votes values, not skin color. The myth of the Southern strategy is just the Democrats' excuse for losing the South, and yet another way to smear Republicans with the label racist. Don't buy it. I'm Carol Swain, professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University for Prager University. When you think about racial equality and civil rights, which political party comes to mind? The Republicans or the Democrats? Most people would probably say the Democrats, but this answer is incorrect. Since its founding in 1829, the Democratic Party has fought against every major civil rights initiative and has a long history of discrimination. The Democratic Party defended slavery, started the Civil War, opposed Reconstruction, founded the Ku Klux Klan, imposed segregation, perpetrated lynchings, and fought against the Civil Rights Acts of the 1950s and 1960s. In contrast, the Republican Party was founded in 1854 as an anti-slavery party. Its mission was to stop the spread of slavery into the new Western territories with the aim of abolishing it entirely. This effort, however, was dealt a major blow by the Supreme Court in the 1857 case Dred Scott versus Sandford. The court ruled that slaves aren't citizens, they're property. The 7 justices who voted in favor of slavery, all Democrats. The 2 justices who dissented, both Republicans. The slavery question was, of course, ultimately resolved by a bloody civil war. The commander-in-chief during that war was the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, the man who freed the slaves. 6 days after the Confederate Army surrendered, John Wilkes Booth, a Democrat, assassinated President Lincoln. Lincoln's vice president, a Democrat named Andrew Johnson, assumed the presidency. But Johnson adamantly opposed Lincoln's plan to integrate the newly freed slaves into the South's economic and social order. Johnson and the Democratic Party were unified in their opposition to the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which gave blacks citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which gave blacks the vote. All 3 passed only because of universal Republican support. During the era of Reconstruction, federal troops stationed in the South helped secure rights for the newly freed slaves. Hundreds of black men were elected to Southern state legislatures as Republicans, and 22 black Republicans served in the U.S. Congress by 1900. The Democrats did not elect a black man to Congress until 1935. But after Reconstruction ended, when the federal troops went home, Democrats roared back into power in the South. They quickly reestablished white supremacy across the region with measures like black codes, laws that restricted the ability of blacks to own property and run businesses, and they imposed poll taxes and literacy tests used to subvert black citizens' right to vote. And how was all of this enforced? By terror, much of it instigated by the Ku Klux Klan, founded by a Democrat, Nathan Bedford Forrest. As historian Eric Foner, himself a Democrat, notes, in effect, the Klan was a military force serving the interests of the Democratic Party. President Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, shared many views with the Klan. He resegregated many federal agencies and even screened the first movie ever played at the White House, the racist film The Birth of a Nation, originally entitled The Klansman. A few decades later, the only serious congressional opposition to the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 came from Democrats. 80% of Republicans in Congress supported the bill, less than 70% of Democrats did. Democratic senators filibustered the bill for 75 days until Republicans mustered the few extra votes needed to break the logjam. And when all of their efforts to enslave blacks, keep them enslaved, and then keep them from voting had failed, the Democrats came up with a new strategy. If black people are going to vote, they might as well vote for Democrats, as President Lyndon Johnson was purported to have said about the Civil Rights Act. I'll have them voting Democrat for 200 years. So now, the Democratic Party prospers on the votes of the very people it has spent much of its history oppressing. Democrats falsely claim that the Republican Party is the villain, when in reality, it's the failed policies of the Democratic Party that have kept blacks down. Massive government welfare has decimated the black family. Opposition to school choice has kept them trapped in failing schools. Politically correct policing has left black neighborhoods defenseless against violent crime. So when you think about racial equality and civil rights, which political party should come to mind? I'm Carol Swain, professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University for Prager University. Look at me. I'm black, one of 12 children born into rural poverty in southwestern Virginia. I started life in a 2-room shack with no running water or indoor plumbing. We didn't even have an outhouse. We often scavenged for food, hunting, fishing, whatever we could find. No rabbit or squirrel was safe around us. Now, this was not true of possums. Even we had our standards. We didn't go to school very often. One year we missed 80 of 180 school days. We all failed that year. I was bullied because of my clothes or what I had in my lunch. Back in those days, having biscuits in your lunch rather than sliced bread was something that could cause you to be teased. My siblings called me Frankenstein due to the scar on my forehead, which you can see is in the appropriate place. They also called me Fish Eyes. Now, anyone who's fished knows that when they come out of the water, their eyes are big and bulging like this. My mother, who might have been considered an early women's liberal today, divorced in the 1950s. Both she and the mountain man she would later marry were alcoholics. I was a teen wife at age 16 and a teen mother at age 17. Now, social scientists would describe people like me as underprivileged, a victim, going nowhere, doomed to fail. And yet, I didn't. Marriage was my escape. I married a neighbor who was a few years older. My self-esteem was so low. I was thrilled anyone would have me. He had a job and a car, and we were soon building a brand new house thanks to the government's FHA 235 home loan program. All we needed was $300 down, and he had his tax return. I was living better than anyone else in my family, and to them, I was rich. I've always had more than others in my family, and frankly, that has caused me a lot of guilt and grief. It was the 1970s, a time of recession. We didn't have much money or food, but we were not on welfare. I had 3 children during this time. I can remember walking to the store, one strapped to my chest, one on my back, and one by the hand. I can't remember how I got the groceries home. It was hard times. But things were just about to get harder. The last born, my baby, my daughter Tracy, died of crib death. I struggled with depression that led to suicide gestures, and I ended up in the mental ward of a hospital. That hospitalization changed the course of my life. My doctor, Dr. Jeff, a young white intern, spoke words that would change how I saw myself. He said, "You're intelligent, attractive, and could do a lot more with your life. I was startled. No one had ever said those words to me, and I began to think of myself differently. I remembered that I was once smart. That conversation was the impetus that led me to earn my high school equivalency and take jobs outside the home. I worked in a garment factory. As a department store sales clerk, I sold smoke detectors door to door, and I even worked in fast food. For half a day, I was so nervous and shy I couldn't hear or call out the orders. So when someone came through the line, I simply gave them what I thought they should eat that day. The interesting thing is that no one complained. At the end of the shift, I fired myself and turned in my uniform. It was an African orderly, a Muslim from Sierra Leone that I worked with at a nursing home, who spoke the words that set in motion my thirst for education. One day in the break room, Abu said, "You ought to go to college. I go to school with a lot of people who are not as smart as you are." Until then, I didn't know that college was a possibility. Now think about it. God used two different men of two different races and religions and backgrounds to speak words of life into me that would set the stage for who I am today. I started my educational journey at Virginia Western Community College. I was a work-study student in the library. The night shift workers frequently called out. That always created chaos. Since I was always willing to work, the library director created a full-time job for me, nights and weekends. It was perfect. I could even take my children to work with me. I earned a 2-year degree in business in 2 years. My goal was to become a mall store manager. But when I began applying for jobs, I was told I needed a 4-year degree. So I decided to get a 4-year degree. I also decided to become an honor student. So I studied books on how to study, and I looked for the major that had the least amount of math. I landed on criminal justice and graduated from Roanoke College, magna cum laude, while working full-time. The only thing I knew after graduation was that I did not want a career in criminal justice. Like a lot of other blacks, I was going to work for the government. I can say that. So I went to Virginia Tech and got a master's degree in political science in 1 year. I was fast at everything. And while I was there, I was pressured to continue my education. I was told that there was a critical need for black professors and black role models. I wasn't interested in any of that. I just wanted a job. I applied for jobs for which I was qualified, and me, an honors graduate, couldn't find one. It was the 1980s and affirmative action was in full swing. At the urging of my professors, I applied to graduate school and was admitted to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's PhD program and given a generous stipend. Whatever professors or authority figures told me I needed to do for success, I did it. As a student, I gave conference papers and became known across the country. I was a hot commodity. Every job offer included a sign-in bonus. And during that era, colleges and universities offered minority positions. But I refused to apply to any of those. I chose Princeton. Princeton won because they recruited me the way I wanted to be recruited. I told people that I would earn early tenure, and I did. My goal was to prove that someone from my background could go to Princeton, earn tenure, and earn it early. I'd achieved my goal and was making more money than I ever imagined. I'd won the career prize, the highest a political scientist can win, and 2 other national prizes for my first book, Black Faces, Black Interests, the Representation of African Americans in Congress, which would eventually receive 3 Supreme Court citations, and I was miserable. Success did not bring happiness. I experienced rejections from white liberals and prominent black scholars who accused me a good Democrat at the time, or being a sellout because I didn't share their worldview on issues like affirmative action, poverty, and race relations. I didn't fit their expectations of how a black person should think or act. I was quietly told, almost in a whisper, you don't need to share the story of where you came from. People don't need to know that. My story was an embarrassment to them, but I was never ashamed of where I came from. My success was undermining their narrative. I was not living their truth, and I was being punished for my success. It hurt. I began to question everything I believed, and I began to doubt myself, and the emptiness and the misery sent me on a search for answers. I've always been a seeker of truth, and I've always known there was something much larger than me guiding my life, and I had to find it. My journey took me many places. The turning point was when I ended up in the Princeton Hospital for a physical condition that led to a spiritual experience and culminated in a Christian conversion. My search for meaning and truth had come to an end, and I was miraculously delivered from a lifelong crippling shyness. And I've been talking ever since. My conversion caused me to re-examine the world through fresh eyes. As I grew in my faith, I discovered more truths. I had been indoctrinated, lied to, deceived, kicked and ignored. I was raised to believe that government protected people and promoted the general welfare. Right? Wrong. Everything the government legalizes is not ethical, correct, or moral. Many times it is the opposite. As a married woman in the 1970s, I was among those first in line for a legal abortion. I reasoned at the time, if it was legal, then it must be okay. The abortion became my deep, dark secret. I kept it hidden and buried for almost 2 decades. But it was the forgiveness Christ offered me in my 40s that enabled me to confess my sin and the consequences of my choices. Confession and repentance led me to deal with the hidden sin and shame. I shared my story with my 2 sons, pro-life friends, and eventually the world through op-eds, speeches, and books. But there were other revelations to come. As a political scientist, I now found myself genuinely interested in what the political parties actually stood for. I looked closely at the party platforms. I saw contradictions between what I believed and what the parties preached. And frankly, I was troubled. I had believed that the Democrats were the party for the working man. Democrats were the party of civil rights. And Republicans, the party of Lincoln, had abandoned civil rights, embraced white supremacists, and become the defenders of the rich. Everyone knew that, right? Wrong. The Democrats were telling me that I was a victim. I needed the government to take care of me. They had all the answers for people like me. Free housing, free health care, free education, free daycare, free transportation, free. Everything for free. No responsibility. Hakuna Matata. No worries for the rest of your life. Hakuna Matata. But I wanted more. So I left the Democratic Party and I became an independent. The problem for me as an independent was that I straddled the middle, which reminds me of a story about an old Texan who said, the only thing that's in the middle of the road are dead armadillos and yellow stripes. So I revisited the party platforms again. This time I began to look more closely at the Republicans. I discovered that many of the things I thought or taught as a professor were lies. I learned that the Republican Party was actually closest to my beliefs about liberty, equality, individualism, free enterprise, free speech, and adherence to the Constitution. Their focus on God, country, and family appealed to me, as did their emphasis on traditional values. That is what enabled me to attain the American dream, So once again, I changed parties. I became a Republican. When I was with them, I was embraced and welcomed. I was never treated as a victim. I never encountered racism. The people that I met cheered and celebrated my success because my story is an American story. Academia was changing, as was I. Academia was no longer a marketplace for ideas. It was now hostile to new ideas and free speech. Critical race theory was metastasizing like a cancer and infecting every department of the university, and it would eventually pollute K through 12 education. There were demands for safe spaces, trigger warnings, personal pronouns, separate graduations and separate course sections, speech codes, and political correctness. And social justice warriors were on the search for microaggressions, perceived insults, or threats to complain about. After 28 years, I made the difficult decision to leave academia and step out into the unknown. I walked away from my hard-won tenure and stepped into a new classroom. Today, my classroom is the world. Today, I use my knowledge and life experiences to give hope to the hopeless, strategy for the warriors, and encouragement to the weary. What motivates me today is to see other people achieve success. So, my dear friends, welcome to my new classroom. Class is now in session, and here is today's lesson. Many of the things that we've been taught or told to believe are false. What largely determines our success or how far we go is determined by what we believe about the world. Positive change cannot happen if we believe the world is stacked against us and that the ability to change our lives or our world is beyond our control. We each have our own story, our own journey, our own path, and our own destiny. Opportunities abound. We can take advantage of them, waste them, or allow others to keep us from seeing them. Our attitudes and what we believe about the world and the possibilities in it will either free us or hold us in bondage. It's our choice. I chose truth, truth that led me to freedom. The truth is out there for you to know. You can find truth, you can know truth, and it is truth that will set you free. Class dismissed.